Hey everyone, this is Mr. Trio, and I'm doing a special video here that covers a depth study which focuses specifically on Germany from 1918 to 1945. This video is the first of 4 in a series, and essentially it will go through all the major points that are covered in the syllabus. There are 4, which includes: was the Weimar Republic doomed from the start? Why was Hitler able to dominate Germany by 1934? Nazi control of Germany, 1933 to 1945, and then finally, life in Nazi Germany. This video will focus only on the first section: was the Weimar Republic doomed from the start? Now, to help put this in perspective, let's take a look at the graph here. We have studied about World War I and World War II sort of as our 2 bookends. This period of Germany history falls in between the 2 great wars. The green section first is the Weimar Republic, which is the first government formed in Germany after the First World War, and then finally the Third Reich, which is the Nazi rise to power, and when Adolf Hitler came to power. Something else to keep in perspective is that the 2 sections that we will be learning about, including the section on the League of Nations and why international peace collapsed, also falls into the same time period. So one of the reasons why this particular depth study is so helpful is that essentially we'll be looking specifically at what is happening in Germany, but at the same time it helps to put in perspective the challenges that the League of Nations had, and also why international peace eventually collapses when Germany invades Poland in 1939. But that's a little later on. We'll talk about that in another unit. There are 4 major focus points that we will be talking about today for this section. How did Germany emerge from defeat at the end of the First World War? What was the impact of the Treaty of Versailles on the Republic? And to what extent did the Republic recover after 1923? And last but not least, what were the achievements of the Weimar period? So let's take each of these 4 one by one. As we look at these 4 topics, one of the things that I always like to think about is, what are the big ideas that we are trying to express? Essentially, I like to boil it down to that after the First World War, one of the big challenges is that Germany needs to form a new government. One of the things that you may remember is that during the First World War, the Kaiser was in charge. So essentially, Germany was a monarchy. And at the end of the First World War, essentially, they had to create a new democratic country with a completely different way of ruling that had never really took place in Germany before. The second big idea is the legacy of the Treaty of Versailles. As a reminder, the Treaty of Versailles is the treaty that ends the First World War and imposes very harsh treatment on Germany, specifically reparations, which are monies that Germany has to pay, and also land territories which are taken from Germany. The legacy of the Treaty of Versailles is essentially one of the main reasons why war will break out 20 years later, in that the treaty did not actually solve the peace problem. In fact, some could argue it simply delays it for a period of time. Third, the big idea that we will also be focusing on is the economy. How, at the end of the First World War, Germany's economy is essentially ruined. And last but not least, we'll have a lighter tone talking about some of the important cultural movements that came out of Germany during this time period in between the wars. So let's take a look at our first focus point. How did Germany emerge from the defeat at the end of the First World War? One of the aspects which is very important to understand is that there were many different ideas that were, vying for control of Germany. There was the Democratic group, which is what the Weimar Republic was, but there were also nationalist groups and also communist groups. And one of the very first challenges for this new republic is what is often referred to as the Spartacus Uprising. This is a group of communists that essentially tried to take over the government. Now, until Hitler firmly establishes power in 1933, there is always a communist movement in Germany. And a lot of this was influenced, of course, by what was happening in Russia, now the Soviet Union at the time. So as we look at the Spartacus Uprising, let's focus our attention on some of the main ideas. The conclusion of the First World War brought political instability to Germany. The new democratic government was under attack by the Spartacus League, which was a pro-communist party. The Spartacus Uprising of 1919 appealed to German workers. The uprising was put down by the Freikorps. Now we'll talk about the Freikorps a little bit later, but essentially these were volunteers that were strongly nationalistic and strongly opposed to communism. And they were a group of military men that essentially were able to suppress the Spartacus League. Turning to coalition government, let's talk about one of the big challenges that Germany faced. In this pie graph, you can see that the Social Democrats make up approximately 38% of the government, which means that 42%, I am terrible in math, aren't I? 62% of the government was not Social Democrats, which means that when Friedrich Ebert, the leader of the Socialist Democrats, came to power, he did have the largest group that supported him, but essentially it's important to remember that there were far more other groups that actually were in the government, which made it very difficult for him to push any type of agenda through because there was so much opposition. And essentially this is what is known as a coalition government. Coalition governments throughout time, whether you're looking at the United Kingdom or 1920s Germany, often suffer from the fact that each side has to negotiate with the other side, and essentially the government that is formed is not pure to one particular idea, but often can be fragmented into many different ideas. So let's take a look at our topic sentence. Friedrich Ebert, the leader of the Social Democrats, had to form a coalition government because his party only controlled 37.9% of the votes. This meant that there were more parties opposed to Ebert than were for him. Coalition governments are often ineffective because they lack a majority to move political policies forward. Last, let's take a look at the structure of the new government and the role of the president. The president of Germany would have been in control and had a mandate to control the military, the army, and below the president was the chancellor. The chancellor was sort of the day-to-day operations person that was in charge of making the laws and passing issues that dealt with money. They worked directly with the Reichstag, who were the representatives, and the Reichsrat. These are sort of governors of each of the different areas. One of the things that we discussed is that the president at the time did not have a majority of the votes, and thus they would often have to resort to what was known as Article 48, which the president could invoke and essentially make decisions that were sometimes unpopular. Let's take a look at our topic sentence. The president worked with the army, Reichstag, and the Reichsrat to run the government, but Article 48 gave the president too much power in that he could overrule all other democratic branches of government in times of emergencies. This is somewhat foreshadowing because we will take a look at essentially how Adolf Hitler, when he becomes the chancellor later on, is able to essentially gain more and more power through this mechanism. Let's take a look at focus point number 2 now. What was the impact of the Treaty of Versailles on the Republic? One of the first challenges that Germany faced is that it had all these large reparations that it needed to pay, but at the time didn't have a lot of money in order to pay. One of the areas of Germany, which was known as the Ruhr, was an area that was especially rich in coal. When France believed that Germany was no longer paying reparations, or maybe Germany wasn't able to, they actually invaded this area, and instead of waiting in order to get the reparations, they took the reparations in the form of coal. There was an incident in which many Germans were killed in the encounter, and this really helped to, number one, inflame the passions of Germans who were upset that their coal was taken, but also it has a lot to do with the fact that it was something that embarrassed the Germans, in that they had lost the First World War and now they were being humiliated even further. Let's take a look at our topic sentence. The treaty imposed harsh reparations on the Germans. When the Germans did not pay, France sent troops to the rural area and took reparations by seizing coal. This greatly angered Germans. Now, one of the things that we talked about in the big ideas section is how this is related to the economy and how Germany was in a very sad state as far as the economy was concerned. One of the largest issues was hyperinflation. We've talked about this a little bit, but let's elaborate a little bit more. In the top right-hand corner, there's a nice chart which talks about how money essentially became worthless. So, how many German marks, marks is essentially the denomination of German money, were needed to buy 1 ounce of gold? In January of 1923, it was 372,000 marks. By September, it was up to 269 million marks. And then just 2 months later, it's essentially 87 trillion marks. As the photo suggests, the paper money was so worthless that it would accumulate in the streets and people would have to clean it up. So essentially, the entire economy based around money system, paper money, was ruined. And this leads to a great deal of panic among the German people, and the German people have to resort to bartering. Essentially, bartering is when you say, for example, I have a bucket of corn, and I will give you this bucket of corn if you give me 10 loaves of bread, or something along those lines, in which people are no longer exchanging paper money or coins, they're actually exchanging goods and services for the day-to-day needs that they have. Let's take a look at our topic sentence. The treaty destabilized the German currency, causing hyperinflation. Germans resorted to bartering and exchanging goods for services. The last section under impact of the treaty was the Kapp-Puscht March of 1920. Remember, this is just a year after the Treaty of Versailles has been settled. Let's look at the topic sentence. The Kapp-Puscht was a demonstration against the government in March of 1920. Berlin suffered from a general strike and the government fled to Dresden. The purpose was to form a nationalist government to replace the Weimar government. So to backtrack a little bit, when Germany was formed after the First World War, this democratic government had major challenges from communists, as we've discussed, and also from nationalists. Nationalists are essentially individuals who are proud of their country, their cultural identity. So essentially, it's like being pro-German for German purposes. And this is one of the major themes that we will discuss when we get to the Nazi movement a few years after this one. Let's take a look at focus point number 3 at this time. To what extent did the Republic recover after 1923? And this specifically deals with what is known as the Dawes Plan. Topic sentence. By 1924, the Weimar government had stabilized in part because Germany had been able to receive a loan of 800 million gold marks from the U.S. This was known as the Dawes Plan. German industry began to recover. So essentially, one of the things that happens after the government has a few stumbles and it's getting started is that by 1924, money starts pouring into Germany, mainly through investments from the United States. This investment helps to establish a more stable economy and investment in German industries. So at this time, people go back to work, factories start producing things, the money system becomes more stable, so you no longer have to barter, and Germany essentially starts to recover. One of the most influential individuals at the time was the chancellor at the time, whose name is Gustav Stresemann. And this is an individual that actually will win the Nobel Prize, specifically for his work to help to bring Germany back from what appeared to be a ruinous time, first with the communist uprising, later with the push of the nationalists. It seemed that in 1924 that Germany was going to be all right and on the right track. There was still a time period in which there was high unemployment, but things were getting better. Of course, it didn't last for too long because the following 5 years later is the Wall Street crash. The Wall Street crash, of course, is in New York City. It's the system in which the stock exchange runs. And when the price of goods and services falls in the United States, it has such an impact that it causes a worldwide depression. One of the direct results for Germany is that a lot of American money that was flowing to Germany as an investment stops. So essentially, this recovery that Germany was experiencing, by 1929, it comes to an end because essentially the money tap is turned off. So Germany starts off low after World War I. It begins to rise starting in 1924, but by 1929, Germany once again is suffering from hardships as it relates to the economy. Let's take a look at our topic sentence. The Wall Street crash in 1929 was a worldwide depression. This limited the number of loans that came to Germany and helped to bring about bring instability back to Germany. Last but not least, let's take a look at focus point number 4, which is probably my favorite section. Specifically, well, I'll tell you a little bit more about that in a minute. The first major issue to talk about is the Locomote Treaties of 1925. Remember, starting in 1924, Germany begins to recover, starts to get back, and this is a series of treaties that essentially brings Germany back into the international fold, gives them back the respect they had lost during the First World War in the first years after the war was over, and essentially allows Germany to join the League of Nations and to resume its place in Europe. Let's take a look at the topic sentence. Locarno Treaties of 1925 helped to bring Germany back to the world community by providing equal status as a member of the League of Nations. Germany established its borders with France and Belgium. As you may remember, Germany sits in between France on the west and Belgium, and that one of the big struggles in the years after the First World War is France wanted that extra security, specifically the areas of the Rhineland not to be militarized, and essentially wanted a safety cushion to keep them safe. By 1925, with these treaties, it looks like Germany is going to be a good neighbor in Europe, and that Belgium and France should not have to worry about being invaded again. And finally, during the 1920s, there was a very rich time period of arts, culture taking place, not only in Germany, but throughout Europe. And at this time, new technologies such as motion picture were taking off. One of the most significant films that came out was a German film producer named Fritz Lang, and he produced a movie called Metropolis. We'll take a brief look at this one in our next slide. And it was also a time in which great art is starting to appear. One of the things which is somewhat sad is that when the Nazis come to power, a lot of these artworks were actually considered dirty or impure, not German. And many of these artists would suffer. Some of them would be arrested, some of them would be sent to concentration camps, and Hitler was very concerned about creating a Germany with a culture which he believed was correct. So a lot of these new artistic expressions that are coming out are things that would greatly offend someone like Hitler, who believed in a very pure Germany. Here is just a brief look at Fritz Lang's Metropolis. It was a groundbreaking film for many reasons. It focuses on the darkness of the modern world that people were living in. One of the things that you can see in this particular clip is the masses of people that are humiliated by the circumstances that they find themselves in. And this particular film really focuses greatly on the rise of the machine. And even for the time period, the special effects are really extraordinary. I mean, they look a little sad by today's standards, but all of the things that you see here would have just captivated an audience in the 1920s. And many of them would wonder, how did they do these types of special effects. It is a film that you can watch in its entirety, and I recommend maybe just watching like 20 minutes or so, but it's well worth it to get a sense of what it was like to go to the movies in the 1920s. I just want to also look at this particular side. The painting on the left is by a German artist named Otto Dix. Otto Dix was a very characteristic type of artist of the time period. And if you know anything about art of the period beforehand, art was beautiful and sceneries, and it was to inspire. And here we have a generation of art that is greatly influenced by the First World War and the horrors of it. And you can see how the war in many ways changed the way that people looked at life. One of the other important movements, not only in film and painting, but was also in architecture, which was known as the Bauhaus movement. One of the things that it was known for was its straight lines and its geometric uses. One of the leaders of this particular movement was Walter Gropius, and Walter Gropius would actually have to flee to the United States when the war breaks out later on. So here we come to the end of this particular presentation. As a reminder, it is just the first of 4 on the focus of Germany between the wars. So let's take a look at our final statements. Each of these statements help to illustrate the major focus points which are a part of this unit. Following World War I, Germany struggled to establish a democratic government. This process was threatened by harsh economic conditions and political opponents like the communist and the nationalist. The Treaty of Versailles would cause economic hardships and a source of shame for the German people. Once again, this is going to be a very important theme that will go on in other units, and specifically one of the main reasons behind the Nazi rise to power. Number 3, by 1924, Germany was on the road to recovery and resuming its place in Europe, but by 1929, the worldwide depression would thrust Germany back to economic distress and lead to a rise of extremists. And last, the 1920s were a time of great artistic expression and a time of more liberal ideas. Many of these artists were banned when the Nazis came to power. All right, so that is the first section of the depth studies on Germany. There will be 3 more videos that follow. We will also have a roundup at the end where we take a look at this particular section and form ABC type questions that allow you to go into more in-depth analysis and be able to create essays which are based on to what extent or what type of opinions do you have about these types of statements. Thanks for watching.